Much, because colleagues, what a privilege it is indeed for us to be gathered at this platform where we are about to launch Professor Allan Boesak's latest contribution in this discourse on Black theology of liberation. Mine is quite simple this afternoon. It's just to introduce and to welcome basically our panelists, as well as also welcoming Professor Allan Boesak, who basically needs no introduction. If we were to think of Allan Boesak, it's not an exaggeration to think that the name has become synonymous with South Africa, particularly with regard to the struggle against apartheid. So when you think Boesak and the pictures that are conjured up are one of a person who stands boldly in the face of apartheid, defying it with all that he has. Boesak has contributed a great deal in terms of that struggle against apartheid. He has published a number of books, some of which have been translated into international languages. But what stands out for me has always been his Black and Reformed, as well as the later books where he deals with topical issues that are relevant for South Africa and the world today. In the contribution that we are going to be talking about this afternoon, we find Boesak reinventing himself and becoming quite relevant when engaging the issues that we are confronted with. And this is something that really, really amazes me, that you have someone who has been as relevant as you was and still has retained that relevance in public discourse, especially when it comes to the relevance of theology of liberation, also speaking to some of the challenges that this theological hermeneutic will have to deal with going forward. So Allan Boesak basically needs no introduction. He's a student of theology known worldwide. He's a churchman. He has led struggles, and so we don't really need to speak much about that. But also the ones that I would like also to welcome here, which of course being Demaine Solomons, who's also very much interested in the topic that we're going to be talking with one another about, who is teaching at the University of the Western Cape. Demaine, I'm looking forward to your contributions also as we sort of unpack the subject that we have in front of us today. Welcome.
Thank you.
Fundiswa Kobo, also a feminist, Black scholar, very much interested in the issues that gang up, particularly on Black people in this country, has written extensively on the subject, and I'm also looking forward to hearing some of her reflections on this contribution that Allan Boesak has just given to us as a gift that we in the discipline of Black theology would really be encouraged to take seriously as we go forward to deal with the issues. You've also heard that, I mean, if you're on these platforms, you would know that Boesak has been quite busy the past few days talking about these topical issues. I tend to think that if there is someone that was able to reinvent himself through all the eras, Boesak for me is that person who has done that with quite great ease. And so colleagues, that is what we have basically for tonight. I don't want to get into the subjects of it because I want to allow space for the conversation and what we've prepared as we sort of launch this book. I'm going to now first give over to Allan, and then maybe if there are certain things that you'd want to really flag, and after you have done so, then I'm going to give over to some of our other panelists as they engage with you on this very important contribution. I don't know if that is in order in that, colleagues.
That's fine.
Okay, over to you, Doc.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Professor Rothney Tshaka, for your very kind introduction today and for your willingness to lead this panel discussion, and to Dr. Fundiswa Kobo and Dr. Demaine Solomons. Thank you for both of you for taking the time to engage with us today and with me I really do feel particularly honored that you have said yes to this panel, and I hope that we will have a fruitful discussion today. Rothney is right. I mean, I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, but I've also been thinking about how I have first entered into these discussions all those years ago. And so in many of the works that I have published over the last 10, 15 years or so, but especially this last one, it is a re-engagement of myself and my thoughts. And in this book, for those of you who have read Vlucht van Gods Verbeelding, where I write about the women in the Bible that I have chosen to see life and biblical stories from below and through the eyes of the women. I was challenged by a young woman on that book one day who said to me, this is such a wonderful book, but will you one day write a book not just about women, but where you engage women as seriously as you can on all of these issues? I take those kind of critical remarks to heart. And so what you see today in Children of the Waters of Meribah is a kind of first effort to grapple with that challenge. And as I thought about it, to grapple with two other major challenges. Those of you who know me know that I love the Bible. I know that the Bible is one of the most revolutionary books, if not the one for me, ever written. It is also one of the most dangerous books if you read it wrong and if you interpreted it wrong. And I will always be reminded of Steve Biko, who told us that in the hands of Black preachers, the Bible is like a poisoned well from which we force our people to drink. Now, that kind of criticism stings for somebody like me and for all of us. But if you take it seriously, it's amazing where honest self-reflection will take you. And this is the journey that I have been on. And in this book, it is most explicit. In Vlucht van Gods Verbeelding, I, for instance, engage with the story of the Canaanite woman and the woman by the well. And those of you who know that work will see how far I have moved from the viewpoints sometimes that I've had in 2005 when that book was published, and what I have learned from the women. And so this engagement with the women and the challenge that they put to male Black theologians in general, to the Black church in particular, and what we can do with that, that is what has driven me. Also, the voices of younger people have challenged me, have inspired me. So my engagement is an ongoing discussion with the younger generation. And that is why I was so fascinated and challenged by Musa Dube in her view of the Bible as an African feminist. And so that kind of radical challenge speaks to me and almost sort of prods me to say, okay, Boesak, what do you have to say about this, if there is anything to say? And so I'm so grateful. Thank you very much for this. And I'm grateful to African Sun Media for making sure that this book is available in South Africa as well, not just being published in the United States where it first came out. And so to Vikas and his company and his team, thank you so very much also for today. I think that's all for now.
Thank you, Doc, for once again just reminding us basically what informed this very, very latest contribution of yours. I'm now going to go over to our panelists here. Maybe let us this time around start with our sister here, Fundiswa, just maybe to point to certain themes in the book that speak to you, and also taking into account what Doc has just said with regards to what informed this contribution. Over to you, Fundiswa.
Yes, thank you so much, Prof. Tshaka, and I'm also actually very honored to be here. I mean, we're talking about the prophet of the South here. We're not just talking about anyone. So when you hear from the prophet himself, my goodness, you don't know what that means to some of us. So thank you so much for this opportunity, Prof. And I think let me start by reminding you actually of a conversation that we had in 2017. Yeah. I think you came to the University of of Pretoria, I think for a seminar. And then after that seminar, Prof. Velem invited a few of us to join you guys for dinner in some restaurant. And actually, I remember some of the words that you said to me, because at that time I was still busy with my doctoral research, and I was still actually trying to understand Black theology of liberation, and what I thought was a problem, which is exactly what I see in your book. Actually, I'm very excited when I go to read your book, and how you helped me also in actually it's more like an affirmation, because I felt that there was a gap, and I felt that women, Black theology of liberation, in dealing with constructs of race and class, they give it more attention, but then when it comes to patriarchal violence, then you see there's a bit of relaxation. So that has always been something that has been troubling me. So I remember what you said then in our conversation in November 2017. It's more like I'm quoting you, because I remember you said the hierarchy of struggles weakened the liberation. And then you said, had Black theology of liberation included women from the start, things would have been different. And you said, in fact, they would have been much better. Yeah. So so now with that and the questions that I have been troubled with, and going back to your book, it's more like an affirmation. It's like, yes, he says it, there's a problem. So seeing how you critique the Exodus narrative in that book, and the scholars that you cite, I think you mentioned Dolores Williams there, and there's Keck Dagan, amongst others, how you engage them. It was firstly so affirming for me as a womanist to see what I have been thinking is a challenge for Black theology of liberation. So in a way, your work, it helps us. It is a book that I would actually recommend for all Black theologians, because if we continue as Black theologians to ignore patriarchy, to exclude women, we're not going to succeed. You quote James Cone in your book, how he also actually pointed to the same problem, that we are not listening to our fellow sisters. It's like we're rambling when we say there is still a challenge. We are not entirely liberated as Black humanity if our sisters are not equally liberated. So there's a sense in which your book, it is affirming for me, but also it responds to a major question that I had in my own journey and doctoral research. So I'm excited about it, but then I want to, yes, I've read it, but it would be nice to actually hear you speak more about it, just to hear the prophet, the words of the prophet about these issues. So I think I'll end for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fundiswa. I'm sure we'll have some time to return to that. Thank you very much for pointing to the issues that really also encourage you and build you in your own scholarship. Dr. Solomons, it's now over to you, my brother.
Thank you.
The issues that for you really in this book help you with your own scholarship and your own reflections?
Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Tshaka, and also to the other panelists, especially Professor Boesak. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real honor to be speaking to you know, some of the issues that you are highlighting in the book. Thank you very much for this book. I mean, I think it's been a long time coming, for me at least, since the 1990s. You know, especially as a response to theologies of reconstruction and development, and you know, all the enthusiasm that you know, went together with that. So I think in that sense, you know, this is a pertinent response to you know, post-apartheid theologies as a means to, or at least pitched as a means to replace or jettison black theologies or liberation theology. So thank you very much for that. I think this is the first systematic exposition or framework coming from, you know, black a scholar of black theology in the post-apartheid era. And I'm not just talking about you know, random ideas that we perhaps highlight and reflect upon in articles or book chapters. This is the first, you know, thoroughly worked out exposition, which I think is it's quite a remarkable feat. So again, I think also if you think about the argument that you present here, and of course it's quite provocative. I mean, there are many issues that you are unsettled, I think, as someone identifying as a black theologian, especially in terms of you know, some of the arguments that you present. But I think at the same time, you cannot help but feel, even if you don't always feel comfortable, you cannot help but feel that, you know, Boesak is onto something here. And here I'm quite Habermasian. It's all about the unforced force of the better argument. And I think in that sense, you know, Prof is really putting a lot of issues on the table, and it's very difficult just to reject that at face value. So in that sense, you know, it forces you to reimagine what you think you know about black theology. And again, for me, that is quite unsettling in a way. So it's uncomfortable because it disrupts the very foundations, I think, of liberation theologies and black theologies in particular. In this sense, and Fundiswa alluded to this, if you think about the Exodus narrative, of course, you know, that's our hermeneutical stance. It's the staple of liberation theologies. But that is called into question now. So whatever romantic ideas you may have about Moses and, you know, the Exodus, all of those things now should be treated with a high degree of suspicion, at least in my mind. So in Boesakian terms, you know, I want to term that today. In Boesakian terms, it really is a farewell to innocence in terms of how we deal with the Exodus metaphor or with the Exodus narrative. Okay, and also I think in the midst of all of this, an unlikely person emerges, a woman of all people. You know, Miriam is given an opportunity through Children of the Waters of Meribah to tell her own story, which again is quite refreshing. And also, I think, again, for the black body in the academy, not just for women, but I think for me also as a black man, you know, to be able to speak your own story on your terms is something, for me, there's a bit of a leap there. There's a bit of a something that somehow, I think, as scholars, we don't reflect upon often enough. And I think in that sense, if I think about Miriam's story, again, we are in a way encouraged to see things quite differently, which again is not usual for anyone, you know, using black theology as a form of self-description. It's an underdog, right? And it reminds us of the struggles of women in general, the dispossessed, you know, those killed in the name of patriarchy, and, you know, and the patriarchy represented by empire. So again, this book, once again, for me also, if I may just wrap up with this last, you know, last comment, I think if anything, just once again affirm that Prof. Boesak has one of very few biblical scholars of liberation in the world. I mean, and not just using the Bible as a side issue, but basing the whole argument coming from from the Bible itself. It's eloquent, and simply put, it's world class in terms of how that argument is presented. So thank you very much for that. That's just a few of my preliminary thoughts.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Demaine, for those very, very important thoughts, quite deep and really questions that Black theology of liberation will have to contend with in today's time. Doc, you've heard the reflections on this particular work. You've heard what has built, some of us, and the things that keep on coming, things that keeps on bringing us back to Boesak. So would you care to just respond to some of these issues so that we can just have a conversation?
Thank you, Prof. Rothney. I'm very grateful for these remarks, and I'm deeply humbled by what you are saying. I mean, the Demaine is not just a question of a rethinking of Black theology that I am proposing here. It is a reappraisal. So much of what we had and taken for granted in Black theology, I am proposing that we rethink, reappraise, set aside those things which I now consider to have been more a burden on us and an obstacle towards genuine, inclusive, radical liberation for all our people. And we haven't had the courage to deal with it. And I mean, there are reasons. You mentioned it just after 1994. There was the surge of these new theologies of reconstruction and development. And there were people who openly wrote long articles and books arguing how Black theology has become completely irrelevant. And not just from the side of the privileged classes who threw this old argument to us now that Marxism no longer exists and Lenin was toppled there in Moscow or in St. Petersburg and Gorbachev has given up. Now Black theology has no reason to exist. I mean, that was a nonsense argument. But apart from that, there were all these other well-meaning, especially liberal theologians, who wanted to argue that Black theology no longer has a place. I've never agreed with that point of view, and there were some of us during those first difficult years who tried. But one thing about Black theology is because we have kept sternly and firmly to the roots of Black theology and to the anchors that made Black theology make sense to so many people during our struggles. Because we've kept that, now 25 years later, people are looking back and people are saying, oh my goodness, we need a different kind of theology. We need to think differently about the church. No, all we need to do is to go back to where we were some 30, 40 years ago, Rothney. It's like the rediscovery of the powerful, sweeping relevance of Biko and Black consciousness. I mean, I now write about Biko and Black consciousness and Black theology in ways that I didn't think of over the last 30 years, but because our situation has become so urgent and all of the issues have been pushed back onto our agenda. I mean, we were a theology that stood for the poor and for the oppressed and for the marginalized, and by some magic flute illusionary nonsense, people were telling us that 1994 meant that there were no more oppressed and there were no more marginalized. Well, look where we are now. I mean, and in this situation where South Africa is still the most unequal society on earth, where a woman is murdered by a partner or a husband or a trusted friend, or a girl is murdered by somebody she trusted every, 6 days or so, and where a woman is raped every few minutes, I mean, so the theology of reconstruction doesn't help you there. Theologies of development doesn't help. Theology of whatever don't help. Liberation theology is still there. And in a sense, it is because of all these events that theology, Black liberation theology was set aside, but it's also because of us. We somehow took the cloak of quietude upon us. And we did not speak loud enough. We did not shout loud enough from the mountains. And I'm thinking, I'm hearing those voices now. And all I'm doing is I'm saying, I'm hearing those voices. And this is my response to the voices I am hearing. The women have never stopped talking. They've never stopped talking. We just didn't hear them. We didn't want to hear them because it was too difficult and too uncomfortable. So now I'm saying, we've got to hear them. It's not nice for us as men. I mean, and sometimes I write these things, Fundiswa, and I think, Boesak, you're actually writing about yourself. Yes, say it. If you can't preach to yourself, don't preach for your congregation.
Yes,
I mean, it's and so it really is a journey of reinventing, but a journey of rethinking and a journey of reconversion. For me, conversion is not just a thing that takes place one moment at one time. It is a daily process of deepening of your theological and spiritual understanding. And for me, the Bible has all of these challenges if one cares to read it right. So that's the one thing. It's not so much also about the Exodus that I ask people to throw the Exodus away. I'm just saying to them, take the Exodus, but think about what it means that we uncritically took the loudest, most dominant male tradition in the Bible around Moses and made that the tradition. And that is a tradition that leads to authoritarianism, as in Moses' rule over his people. He was an autocrat, and that patriarchal tradition leads to violence and to conquest. And that is why Palestinians and Native Americans and Africans ask those questions. How can you cling to the Exodus if it means that your land became the promised land of white Christian invaders, colonialists, and imperialists? Now, why haven't we taken that question seriously? And Robert Warrior, as you will see in the book, was the first Native American to raise that. And who was the first from Black theological circles to take that up? Not a male, but Cheryl Kirk-Duggan. She was the one who said, he has a point, and we have to take this point seriously. And so, yes, and when I began to think about and read it and take the women seriously, Miriam is an amazing revolutionary, and I don't know why we haven't discovered that. It is true, though, Rothney, when you said is Boesak against Boesak or something like that, because I also now say to myself, all those sermons about Moses that I preached, I have to go back and say, well, no, let's rethink that. And we have to seriously take Miriam out of the shadows and place her right in the center of the spotlight. And we must learn from her. And if you read those 3 chapters, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4, about Miriam and her emergence, about the women in the birthing chamber and their resistance to Pharaoh, about what Miriam did with that rebellion in the book of Numbers 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, and 20, and how she changes the dynamics of the rebellion against the authority of Moses and against the style of Moses and against this God that Moses claims is his God and Israel's God. And Miriam says, no, there's another God out there. It's like Black theology. When white preachers told us this is the God that says slavery is okay, that justifies violence, that justifies land theft, that justifies genocide, that's your God. And Black theology says, no, that's not our God. That may be your God, but there's another God. And when we look closely at Jesus, we discovered that other God. Miriam does the same thing. with Moses. And that's how I read this. And so I'm pleading for Black theology to rethink, to refigure, to reconstruct, to embrace Miriam rather than the Mosaic tradition, and make our theology a theology that follows the Miriamic tradition. Now, it is true, Fundiswa and Demaine, that it is, as some people would say, provocative. But I mean, isn't the truth always like that? It provoked me first to self-reflection and to self-criticism, and to think, if the women are right, then it means I was wrong all these years. And so I have to go back and say to myself, how do I rectify that? And so this book is the result of that kind of reflection, and listening to Africans, listening to Native Americans, listening to people whose land have been stolen, and now they said, and in Africa and South Africa now, land is all of a sudden right in the center of things. How can Black theology not speak of those issues? So those are some of the things, and we can't speak honestly about those issues if we cling to an Exodus narrative that leads to the conquest of Palestine, that is now justified by very prominent people in our communities, standing by the side of the Israeli apartheid, murderous, genocidal government vis-a-vis the Palestinians. They use Joshua 6 as their basis for the policies that they now follow, and as the justification for the continued stealing of the land of the Palestinians. Now, how can we say, on the one hand, my Palestinian brother and sister, I love you, I'm with you, I stand with you in the struggle, but theologically, we justify what is happening to them and to their land? Those contradictions can no longer exist. They're not sustainable, they're not justifiable, and they're not theologically right. And so this is what we are trying to do. I mean, we can come back to the New Testament part of it, but where I was just blown away by the way in which Musa Dube had approached these issues, and my desire to engage with her to see whether we can have a different kind of conversation.
So I was talking to some of my friends the other day, and we spoke about this book of yours, and how you seem to have reinvented yourself in public discourses. And I said, if there is one consistent brother in Black theology, that is Allan Boesak for me. And of course, that's just came easy for you. There's a number of things that came with that consistency. Yeah. And so for you speaking truth to power in the way that you do, of course, not everyone likes that. But there is also another dimension, Doc, and we have heard also Demaine mention the fact that in the late 90s there were all attempts to move away from naming Black and to find all kinds of nice words that people are comfortable with, that's shown that we are together, yet in reality we're not. And of course, public theology also tends to be in the midst of that, because it is seen as not as militant. You see, that's the problem. Black theology is perceived to be too militant and problematic, and therefore there's all attempts to find nice ways of coding it. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that you're right. I mean, from the very beginning, and I think our colleague and brother Tenyuku Maluleke has made that argument also for a long while now. From the moment, I mean, it was so clear. First we had theology of development, and then we had reconstruction, and then we had public theology. And all of a sudden, public theology was presented as a replacement for Black theology, because it was more refined, because it was not so militant, because it was not so challenging. And if you look what happened in the academy, Black theology was never given space in the academy unless you fight for it tooth and nail, and every day like a tidal wave you have to go back in, and they spit you out, and then you have that's what happened. Still today it isn't the case. Public theology came in, and like magic, I look at not only in South Africa, but elsewhere, with my contacts in the United States and elsewhere, all these centers for public theology. If you want money for programs, don't call yourself a center for Black theology, my sister, you will get nothing. Call yourself a center for public theology, and the money will flow in, and the programs will. Look at, you guys go to the websites and look at seminaries in the United States. It's amazing. There's always money for that. So, like we did in the struggle, you always have to ask, where does this money come from, and why are they giving it to you? And so there is no center for Black theology and for Black theological studies. We have individuals like yourselves who offer this to our students. And UW, I know because I spoke to the students there. UNISA, I now know. And we have the legacy of Vuyani Velum at University of Pretoria. But if my contract there comes to an end next year, I don't know what will happen to Black theology at that university. So all of these issues, and you're absolutely right. But I mean, we started to say not only why is public theology given as a more acceptable replacement for Black theology, but also what is this public that public theology is talking about? And I raised the question in my new book. I asked the question, I mean, is this the public, is the public of the oppressed and the marginalized, or is this the more civilized, acceptable public of the academy? And that question has not been responsibly answered as far as I can see. And if you see the agendas of public theology, it is everything that Black theology tried to put on the table, but in a much more acceptable way to the academy and to the powers that be. I mean, public theologians may be public theologians. Black theologians are organic theologians. We rise up from within the people, from within the struggles within the people, and we speak that language. And it's not a language that those in power want to hear. And so that's why Black theology was not very much loved and accepted by the apartheid regime. But I do not think that it is very much accepted now by our present rulers, because the dynamics remain the same. You raise the same issues. And if you are a theology that truly speaks from below, that shouts from the rooftops as a prophetic, challenging theology, then you will have difficulty with government. And so yeah, that is a question that we have to battle for ourselves. But I'm at the point where I think as much as we can, and that's why we must keep on writing, write articles, write the books, prescribe them to the students, let the students understand what there is on the table, not just what they have inherited from a colonialist structure of education in theology, a Eurocentric view of everything. Let them see. I mean, Rothney Tshaka himself, you make that strong argument that we must overcome that dichotomy between Black theology of liberation and African theology as a cultural phenomenon. And you say, no, the two belong together. And you will have seen in the book, I say, that's exactly what Desmond Tutu said 40 years ago. And so the argument is still very, very clear. We must just now we must not be shy. We don't have time. We must not be ashamed of our Black singularity in looking at things theologically. And we must not be too civilized in what we do. We must be done with a language of pacification. We must really become far more prophetic in our theological stance than we have been over the last 10 years or so, perhaps.
All right. So we are now at 2022. I want to check if there are any questions. If not, maybe we can check from the panelists if there are other issues that you'd want to probe more.
Yeah, Prof, thank you very much. Prof, I just want to follow up. I mean, and because you, especially if you think about, again, sorry that I'm going back to Exodus, but I think it's an important point, especially in terms of making sense of the history and the legacy of liberation and black theologies. And also the role of Miriam. And of course, the other important aspect for black theology is, of course, Jesus' ministry. So now the question that I was thinking when I was reading the book is, what does this perhaps imply or infer when we think about, the woman in the New Testament as well and Jesus' ministry? And, Mary Magdalene came to mind, especially in terms of her prominence, and also perhaps also the way she's marginalized up until this day. So is there perhaps a way to also reimagine and rethink Jesus' ministry as a whole? Because I think it's, if that is the case with Exodus and with Miriam and Moses, of course, those things should be taken into account with what's happening in the New Testament as well.
Well, you will remember that in the book, I end a chapter with the question why black theology takes Jesus's pronouncement and his message and his manifesto in the synagogue in Nazareth in Luke chapter 4 so seriously, but we don't take the revolutionary song of his mother as seriously as that. And what we have allowed ourselves is to be caught up in this theology of the veneration of Mary. She's the queen of heaven. She is this wonderful woman who gave birth to Jesus, and that is it. But if you analyze the Magnificat, then you can see what it is that this mother has been teaching her child. Because much of what Jesus says and does in his ministry is, you can see, is reflected in what Mary says. That's a revolutionary song. And I mean, I imagine not only that song being sung in cathedrals. I mean, I think Mary, as she had this little baby, that is a what do you call it? A lullaby to him. I mean, he grew up on her knees. Think about it, just naturally. This is the woman who said that. Why wouldn't she teach that to her child as he was growing up? Why wouldn't she say to Jesus, this is what I believe? It's like my mother when we grew up, and my dad died when I was very, very young. And so my mother is the one who taught us, and around the table at night, she was the one who prayed to God as the God of the poor, as the father of the orphan, as the defender of the defenseless and of the widow. And when you think about that and you ask her, what does it mean? I mean, that means that around that table, from my mother, before I read Jim Cone, I had the rudiments of a liberation theology, if you think about what that means. And so rethinking Mary, rethinking the few words she is given in the Gospels, but also see her within the context of all the other women disciples. She's always mentioned. Now, if this is a woman who is mentioned that she followed Jesus with other women, the other Mary and Mary Magdalene and so forth, what does that say about her leaving the rest of her children behind, or did she take them all with them? I mean, this is a new dedication that we see to what? There is a moment where in the Gospel of Mark, I think, where what Jesus says is so radical that his family tries to tell him, you got to cool it down. But Jesus would have said to her what I have said to my mother, it's okay that you tell me I mustn't do this, I mustn't do this because I'm getting the government angry at me, but don't forget who taught me this stuff. So I think going back, Jesus' ministry is a radical ministry. But think about, it didn't fall from the sky. He got taught some stuff by the mother who had borne him and who had raised him. we think too much of Jesus as disconnected from this very basic primal bond. And especially now we know what it is that she said as recorded in Luke chapter 1. So yeah, all of those things I think we need to think about again and quite seriously and put that on the table for discussion.
Good stuff. There are quite some comments in the chat section, but can we invite some more questions if there are, maybe from the other attendees?
While they are thinking, Rothney, I was just thinking now, I mean, this is the kind of conclusion. You remember the portion in the book in chapter 4, where Miriam speaks up and asks the question, has the Lord only spoken through Moses? You remember that question. And this is the kind of conclusion I draw. And I'm just reading a paragraph from this thing. Now I'm saying, a Marihamic Black theology and the church in the Marihamic tradition would have known better the difference between being mesmerized by Nelson Mandela and remaining faithful to Jesus of Nazareth. We would perhaps have been bold enough to ask the essential question, has the Lord spoken only through Mandela? Has the Lord not spoken through us? Has the Lord spoken only through the celebrated negotiators of the ANC, whose wisdom was extolled as matchless and flawless by the white-controlled media in South Africa and abroad? Has the Lord not also spoken through us in the struggles of our people, in the sacrifices made by our youth, in the blood that stained the streets of our townships, in the stubborn nonviolent militancy of the determined masses, in the revolutionary patience of our elders, and in the hopeful resilience of the dreams of our children? Has the Lord not also spoken through us in our songs of sorrow and our songs of freedom, in the cries for justice and the outrage against injustice, in our battles against despair and our fierce embrace of hope, in our standing for the truth and our refusal to submit to the lie? Now, I mean, that's where Miriam brings me. And if you take that and you think about that and what has happened since 1994, isn't that one of the most important questions that we have to ask ourselves, and then ask ourselves, what are the consequences once we begin to understand the meaning of those questions and the answer to those questions? That's why I love Miriam so much.
Yes, yes. It's contagious. I mean, just the way you explain that. You know, it's even better when you speak, Doc. You write brilliantly, but it's even better when you speak. Fundiswa, do you want to come back for the last bite?
Yes, thank you so much, Prof. Again. Yes, the passion. When I listen, I'm just so excited. I was also thinking, I think the question that you posed, Prof. Tshaka and Prof. Boesak's response, the issue of this question that always crops up wherever, the issue of the relevance of Black theology, which I had I don't know whether it's a pleasure or what, of experiencing when I had to stand in for Prof. Willem last year in one of his classes, where actually students, they ask that kind of a question. But then the issue for me, and the whole issue of Black theology, public theology, and so forth. So I'm just wondering now, when I listen to Prof, him going back to the foundations, all these critical questions that he is asking when looking at Black theology of liberation. I'm just wondering now, when I think about Professor Vuyani Velem, in I think his latest works, where he told us to somehow unthink the West because they're a distraction. So once, in a way, we start moving away from explaining ourselves to them, then we get this we are able to reinvent ourselves, perhaps a lack of a better word. We are able to even go back to say, yeah, but then we can improve. We can always be better people as Blacks, away from the West. So I was just thinking what Prof. Boesak's thoughts would be on that.
Well, I mean, as you know, Vuyani Vellum had this thing about him. He was a very deceitful kind of guy, because he comes to you and he has this beautiful smile and this gentle face and this soft voice. And when he speaks, you listen, and then wham, he hits you. And I've always thought that must be one of the most effective ways. God has given this guy this face and this voice to bring us questions that are very difficult, and he constantly raised those questions. And one of the things that we must do is not to just memorialize him and his work, but to actually take up these questions. And I mean, I can see, and you guys have worked together and you've given us the honor to participate in that book that honors his memory. But I was thinking the other day, maybe it's something for UNISA that we, if we can, do a thing like this, and then raise up specifically on those questions that Vuyani Vellum raised that made us most uncomfortable,
Sure.
that caused us most difficulty to deal with. The questions he raises about the Bible, the question he raises about Black spirituality, and all of those things. And as Fundiswa says, I mean, things that you don't know how to talk about, but he had the courage to raise it. And so maybe that would be part of a project for us to further develop, because Black theology will only develop as strong as we should be if it is in a give and take of critical and self-critical conversation and reflection, and then committing that to paper so that it can be wider than just our circles.
Perfectly said, Doc. I don't know if there are other questions. I can't see hands that are raised or something like that, because you would probably guide me. But we've got a few more minutes before 5 o'clock. I want to check with Demaine if he's okay.
Yeah, I've got a quick question, Prof.
Yeah.
And this is with regards to the role of women, and also in your approach in the book. Don't you also think, and you allude to this in the book, that by virtue of being a woman, in the same way by virtue of being Black, does not disqualify you from being a functionary of empire? I would be interested for you just to unpack that a little bit, because I think we should also be careful, just like being Black, we should also be careful not to romanticize what it means to be a woman in light of, say, leadership, for example. So could you just unpack that a little bit, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in the book, I stick out my neck a little bit because I am very wary of what the Americans call identity politics. And so because somebody is Black, that person has to be the very best. And you have to, if that person is a politician, you have to vote for that politician. Doesn't matter what that politician thoughts are, whether that politician has policies or the wrong policy, doesn't matter. I vote for her or for him because he is Black. And because he is Black, he will represent me. Well, 25 years here in South Africa has disabused us of that notion. So I speak like that in the United States, but they're much more sensitive in the US on this question of identity politics. Because now look, Mr. Joe Biden now has Kamala Harris as his running mate. And so the expectation mostly is that everybody should be excited because she is a Black woman. Well, I'm not excited. Kamala Harris doesn't have good policies. She may be black, but she is only black by face. She is not in any way connected to the oppressed black people or any other people in the United States. She is an acceptor and an implementer and a builder of the incarceration state in what she has done. She is as good as Hillary Clinton and a representation of white American imperialism and exceptionalism. Her foreign policies towards us will be as bad as Trump's. Don't you even think that it'll be different? She doesn't even talk about foreign policy. Now, to me, that is not feminism. And here in South Africa, we have worked with the term not only feminism, but for menism. So these are women who are for men in their political activity. They fit very nicely into the patriarchal mold. They don't challenge patriarchy. They don't challenge heteronormative sexuality. They don't do any of that. They do exactly what the patriarchal political dominant framework wants of them to do. All they are is they make it more difficult for us because they say, if you attack me, then you are a sexist or you are patriarchal. Well, I'm too old to fall for that trick and I've seen too much. No, really. So for me, I don't ask, are you black in that sense, Rod?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
if you are a politician, tell me whether your politics will be the politics that will challenge all of these issues, that will eliminate poverty, that will, do you stand against neoliberal capitalism? If you don't, I won't vote for you. And these are for me the questions that are important today and that we must put on the table. Are you for restitution of land or not? Do you have excuses? Are you still covering for our reconciliation that it was such a sellout to our people and our sacrifices? If you're not right on these things, I won't vote for you. I don't support you, whether you are a woman or whether you are gay or whether you are black. None of those identity things matter to me. It's what you stand for. And it's how you stand for what you stand for. I mean, Nina, and just so Nina Turner is an American woman, was with Bernie Sanders, daughter of a black preacher. And she says her grandmother told her, when you look at politics, remember three things. You must have a wishbone, and you must have a jawbone, and you must have a backbone. The wishbone is where your dreams and your ideals come from. We want to build, like we said, a non-sexist, a non-patriarchal, non-racial democracy. That's your dream. But you have to have a jawbone so that you can articulate what you feel and that you can speak truth to power, even as you speak comfort to those who continue to suffer under unjust policies. But when you have dreamed and when you have spoken truth to power, then you must know they'll come down hard on you, and therefore you need a backbone to stand and not fall and not cave in. So a politician, man, woman, gay, black, doesn't matter to me. If you don't have a wishbone backed up by a jawbone and backed up by a backbone, you're not my kind of politician. And so don't tell me about all these identity things. Show me what you stand for, show me where you stand, and then we'll know what kind of person we are dealing with. And that's how I feel about these issues.
Well, Doc, we seem to have come to the end of this conversation. We have got some information that is on the chat group. Vickers is trying to disseminate that with regard to the book. But I think it is important what we have just said in your conclusion there, that these are all things that point to the need for Black folk to really have serious conversations that go beyond this identity politics, so that we are able to speak to issues for what they are. You see, one of the frustrations that we are confronted with is that our white brothers and sisters who want to be part of this conversation seem in most cases impatient to hear us have a conversation about issues that gang up on Black people particularly. And that's one of the reasons why Vuyani Belem would say, let's have a black theology that is removed from the West. In other words, not have the West in our minds as we reflect about issues that gang up particularly on us. And by saying that, we are not at all saying we are exclusive club. We are simply saying if you are really sincere about these issues that we are talking about, come in and understand your place in this conversation.
Exactly.
That is basically the only thing that we are asking. So with these words, thank you very much for this book, which is a gift to black theology. Of course, also we draw inspiration from the fact that you speak truth to power, and it is never an easy thing. And that's one of the things that I have this kind of love that I have for you. I want to thank you for availing yourself to speak to us about this book. I want to thank the other panelists also for availing themselves so that we can reflect and have this conversation. But it is my hope that we will have this conversation even beyond this platform that we have currently here.
Yes.
Thank you very much, all of you guys, because it's now over to you.
Thank you very much, all of the panelists and the attendees, also the people who joined via Facebook. Thank you so much for your participation. We trust that this conversation will go further. I posted the information on the availability of the title on the chat. Please go and look at the book and download it. It's available on Amazon, on IGSI, and Google Books, and please read it. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending the launch, and have a wonderful day further. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate this.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, guys.